Hey everybody, thanks for joining. We're going to wait just another 30 seconds to allow everybody else to attend, and then we'll get started here in the next minute or so. But again, thank you for joining today, and apologies for the few minutes of technical difficulties that we've experienced so far. All right. Baby, you ready to go? Why don't we go ahead and get started in that case? Good morning, everybody from wherever you are calling in the world today. My name is Neil Walia. Thank you for joining Quorum Summit today. Apologies again for the technical difficulties. You know how these things go, but my name is Neil Walia. I am coming to you live from the great city of Lafayette, Colorado, where I'm joined today by my dear friend and colleague, Heba Mahmood from the Consumer Technology Association. Heba, thank you so much for being here today. How are you doing this morning?
Excellent. Thank you for having me.
No, I'm happy to have like one of the smartest like IE&D experts that I know having this conversation with me. So, listen, for everybody's awareness, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what CTA is doing in the I&D space. For those of you who are unaware, that's inclusion and diversity. I'm going to share a little bit with y'all about what Quorum is doing, but our goal today is to share some of the best practices that we've come to understand in this space, so that hopefully one day y'all can take these and make your organizations that you work at, the most inclusive and diverse places that they can be. And so Heba has been in this industry for some time. She has built herself quite the reputation and network within DC and across the world. And so Heba, you know what, why don't we just go ahead and get started with that. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work at the Consumer Technology Association.
Awesome. Thank you again for having me. So I'm Senior Manager of Diversity Initiatives at CTA, the Consumer Technology Association. CTA is a trade association representing the $422 billion U.S. consumer tech industry, which supports about 18 million U.S. jobs. We have about 2,000 member companies representing every size and specialty in the tech industry. So we have the big companies like the Googles and the Amazons, but 80% of our membership is small businesses and startups like Quorum. We advocate on behalf of the industry. We develop technical standards, produce market research reports, and along with D&I, diversity inclusion initiatives, we have a multi-pronged future work initiative that looks to create high-skilled employment opportunities for all Americans. And we're best known by, we own and produce CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, which is the largest consumer trade show in the world in Las Vegas every year.
No, that's great. And yeah, CES, I was there for your I&D track last year. That was amazing. For everybody who's on the webinar right now, make sure y'all try to look that up and go there if you're interested in this work. It was absolutely amazing. But, Heba, I'd love to focus a little bit more about your work in the I&D space. But can you tell us a little bit about like the origin story? How did this all come into fruition? How did you all formally put together a body specifically to work on inclusion and diversity at your organization?
Sure. So CTA had always been doing things around D&I, but it didn't really have a formal home until about 2018. And at that time, our formal D&I work started with our CTA board making a commitment, understanding that 80% of our membership is startups and small businesses. They made a commitment to invest $10 million into venture funds and firms to invest in women and other underrepresented startup founders. And so at CES 2019, our CEO, Gary Shapiro, made that initial announcement. And with that initial commitment, our diversity initiatives team was launched, and I was brought in to create a fuller strategy that focused on helping our member companies and our industry be more welcoming and inclusive. And so our diversity initiatives are more external facing, and our mission of those initiatives is really to create smaller programs and initiatives that encourage member companies to develop their own diversity initiatives, but work together to create an engaged, diverse, and inclusive tech ecosystem. And we're very focused through our diversity initiatives on 4 key areas. So promoting and investing in a diverse entrepreneurial ecosystem, which is tied directly to our $10 million investment. Serving as an industry thought leader and really communicating the benefits of a diverse and inclusive tech ecosystem. Sharing best practices, like you said, we're going to do today, sharing best practices for attracting, engaging, retaining, advancing underrepresented talent and communities in the tech ecosystem, and then encouraging, supporting, and engaging that K through 12 and beyond STEM pipeline. So we help build a more future-looking diverse tech ecosystem.
Now, let me just clarify something. Did you say 2018 was when this all kind of first got started? See, that's like absolutely amazing to me, right? Because what I see CTA as is being one of the thought leaders in this space. And basically what you've just told us is that like in 3 years, you've managed to like accomplish so much. And like, I do think that's really cool about IND in general, right? Like even as far as like Quorum's origin story with IND goes, you know, like we were a tech startup, so a little bit different in terms of kind of, you know, what dynamics we were dealing with organizationally and all that good stuff. But, you know, it really took just a couple of me and my colleagues coming together, putting together a game plan, talking about why this was so important for us as an organization to commit to this. And, you know, in 2018, we approached our leadership and, you know, almost right away, we got the green light to go. And like, you know, here we are 2 years later talking about this and, you know, sharing what we've done so far on our journey. And I just think that's like an important thing for all of us to remember, that like with the right ingredients and circumstances at the table, like this IND work can start pretty quickly and materialize into some great benefits for your organization. One thing that comes to mind, and you know, I think this should be fairly obvious, but I always love hearing people's own individual responses to this question, but why is IND so important for organizations to be thinking about? You know, not just from like a moral standpoint, but maybe even from like a business perspective going forward.
Definitely. So I think you said 2018, so we both started around the same time. It must have been the year that IND was like in the air even more so. So good work for us. But why is it important? So, I mean, obviously it's important because it's the right thing to do, right? So people always think that it's the feel-good work, right? But I like to look at it as not only it's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, right? And so knowing and understanding that diversity and inclusion isn't only the right thing to do, but it's a way to help you grow and innovate is really key and really important to the work that we do. A lot of times people think of it as like corporate social responsibility, but there's a really strong business case for diversity and inclusion. So I put together some numbers just to tell you or show you just how important D&I is to the bottom line. So there was a report that was done in 2016, but it's very relevant still, called Decoding Diversity, which was very focused on the tech industry, and it was put out by Intel and Dahlberg. And they looked at a number of various things, but looked at improving the ethnic and gender diversity in the US tech workforce, right? And it presents a really huge economic opportunity. So it could create between 470 to 570 billion dollars in new value for the tech industry, and could add 1.2 to 1.6% to the national GDP alone. And then just this year, a new study from Citigroup estimated that the US has lost approximately 16 trillion with a T
Wow.
dollars since 2000, just 2000, as a result of discrimination against the Black community. And that includes things like discriminatory lending practices, unfair wages, access to education, and a lot of other different factors. But by overcoming these challenges, they suggest that the economy could see a $5 trillion increase if some of these issues were tackled. So it's much more than just doing what feels good or what feels right. It really is and does help companies do better. With advancements in technology, companies are creating millions of new jobs, and there's an unprecedented demand for high-skilled tech workforce, and beyond. Every sector is looking for more highly skilled people, right? And so diversity and inclusion initiatives helps organizations really recruit the best talent, but then it also helps them create cultures where the that talent stays and advances within their organizations. So CTA, I mentioned that we do we have a future of work initiative. And so we put out a future of work study annually, which surveys tech industry leaders on current and future workforce issues. And we just released our 4th study last week, and we found that 80% of tech companies will need more employees with technical skills, at least 80%. Almost 9 in 10 tech companies, which is 86% of those respondents, have at least one current or planned diversity inclusion initiative at their organization. And 42% of companies will devote staff and resources to hiring more employees from underrepresented backgrounds. So we're starting to see, even within the tech industry, that companies understand the benefit of these diversity initiatives and hiring and engaging a diverse workforce because they see that it affects more than just the feel good. It really does affect that bottom line.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the important points you mentioned is that, like, I know we're focused a bit on tech just because obviously that's kind of the space Quorum is in and CTA is in, but like these benefits obviously cross over into every industry, right? I mean, that includes public affairs, that includes business, that includes everything that you can think of. And so whether it is, to, make certain metrics or standards in terms of, monetary output, whether it's to, build a more inclusive culture, there are so many benefits to IND. And I think that's really important to hit upon. Hiba, you just kind of listed a lot of different types of things y'all are working on, a lot of great outputs that CTA has managed to accomplish. But, I think one of the things that I think about is that there's obviously a lot of work that goes in between that, right? I mean, like you guys have done so much, you all have done so much to improve. See that, that comes from being in this space, right? I start catching myself making these mistakes and then hopefully I can correct automatically. But
exactly.
One of the things that I think is so tricky, right, is how you measure success, especially in a world that is becoming, increasingly, quantitative and more mathematically oriented, because we want to measure success truly, right? So can you speak to that a little bit? Like at CTA, how do you all measure success when you are, putting together programs, initiatives, partnering with internal, external organizations and all that good stuff?
Definitely. So I think, again, going back to the business case for D&I, if your D&I goals and initiatives and programs are tied to your overall business strategy, then you have no choice but to be measuring them and to make sure and ensure that they are meeting, that they're effective and that they're meeting your overall goals, right? And so at CTA, we were really intentional when we started. We had internal discussions about, although it was our programs are external facing, we had internal discussions about what already was being done, what success looked like to all of our other cross departments internally around D&I, because we weren't doing the work alone. It's not a siloed approach. We took a cross collaborative approach to doing the work. And so making sure that all stakeholders within the organization had input into what success looked like. But we also did a lot of external roundtables, and we brought together diversity and inclusion practitioners from our member companies to tell us what they need. And based on their needs, we really developed a strategy that would put that work forth. And so again, I said our work was focused on 4 key areas, and that came to be because we put together a strategy that was really looking at addressing the challenge, which was bringing in, retaining, and advancing diverse talent and creating these cultures that are inclusive in the tech industry. And so we outlined our strategy, we defined what diversity and inclusion meant, and then we put together specific goals around each of our key programs. So you talked about coming to CES in 2020 this year. It seemed like so long ago, but 2020 this year for our first D&I experience at CES. It was called Innovation for All. And so we put that program together. We didn't just like throw spaghetti at the wall and hope that it stuck. We kind of really looked at like, who do we want to engage? What part of the conversation do we want to engage? We want to tie it back to those 4 key strategy areas that we developed as part of our strategy. Who are our member companies that are doing the work? How many people do we want to engage? And we set out to measure specific engagement metrics. And then we really took those engagement metrics and made sure to share them internally with leadership, externally with stakeholders that were involved in the program. We surveyed people before the show, specifically on our diversity initiatives. We surveyed them after to kind of get that baseline for how we did. And so it's really helping us, and it's really informing that data from last year, informing the show that we put together for CES 2021 and the programs that we put together moving forward. So I think any program, I mean, overall, definitely having the strategy tied to your overall business goals, but any program or any initiative or project that you put forth, ensuring that you intentionally put metrics around it and are measuring, looking, asking what success means, measuring that, and then coming back to the data again and again and again so that you're able to improve upon that.
That's excellent. Now, one thing that comes to mind is that, so you've touched upon CES a few times, right? And when I think of CES, I mean, that's like arguably one of the largest events, worldwide, whether it's for tech or whatever purpose that you're going to, right? And so, tying it back a little bit to like Quorum's origin story and kind of, what we've been able to accomplish, like I imagine that my journey in a tech startup that's relatively small, right, with a lot less overhead and things like that, my journey through I&D has been a little smoother in the sense that, like, it took me and a few colleagues to come up with this idea and this body. We went to our leadership, and they basically were like, yeah, this sounds like a great idea, let's do it. And then, like, that was it, like that's all that happened. And then we just kind of had free control. We did this all, and we had support from them. Shout out to Jonathan, Alex, and Melissa for all their support and everything. But it made a very smooth process in terms of like putting this all together and then immediately experiencing success. But then, like, when I think of CTA, we have a much larger organization. You're partnering with much larger firms and companies and things like that. And so, I have to imagine that whether, you're a bigger or smaller organization, like, things are going to be a little bit different for how you approach this work, right? So can you talk to us a little bit about what are the challenges that organizations face, especially when it comes to size, right? When they're trying to, put some type of I&D body or work together?
Sure. So I think along the journey of D&I, wherever you are along that journey, there's always challenges and opportunities. And one of the key areas and ways that we collected best practices and kind of learned what our member companies were facing was through our CTA D&I working group, which is a member forum for our member companies to really talk, share best practices, and engage with one another. We're so happy to have Quorum on that CTA D&I working group from the start. But what I've seen kind of with smaller organizations, where sometimes they lack resources like money or staff to devote solely on D&I initiatives, right? Because it's a volunteer effort on your end. They're because of their size and because of kind of the grassroots efforts, like you explained, like your staff got together, you found out that you wanted to do this, you went to leadership, and it ran smoothly. So you guys are much more nimble in addressing challenges as they arise. So just to give an example, after the murder of George Floyd in June, a number of small member companies found that their employees wanted to create initiatives in this space and that they really wanted to talk about this at work. They wanted to do something, right? And so they were quickly able to create those places and spaces and opportunities to bring their staff together. And a lot of them were able quickly to launch a strategy, launch an initiative, put resources aside specifically for this work, right? Whereas larger organizations that have the resources, that have the staff to devote to D&I work, that have the money to go towards these initiatives, of course, that's their biggest opportunity, right? But then it's challenging when they have to be nimble in a situation like the murder, like after the murder of George Floyd, with the rise of organizations talking about social justice, right? And so it was harder for them to address these challenges and create these opportunities. But for larger organizations, definitely having the dedicated resources to devote to this work across the organization and try to make it scale it across many different departments or locations or whatever it may be. So I think there's opportunities and challenges whether you're small or big, but I think whatever size you are, it'll only be successful if you have leadership buy-in, you have accountability, and you have the data to measure your success. That's the only way that I've seen, whether small or large, that it's effective.
No, that's great insight, and I completely agree. I'd love to like take that just a bit further, right? And maybe talk a little bit more in detail, right, about what are maybe some of these best practices, right, when it comes to, inclusion and diversity. Conversely, I'd love to hear a little bit about like, what are some of the things you've seen that maybe trip organizations up, right? Like, what are some of those tactics that maybe seem like a great idea, like low hanging fruit, maybe we should be doing this, but then for whatever reason, it doesn't materialize in the way that an organization maybe thought it would. Like, what are the,
Definitely.
yeah.
Sorry to cut you off. So I think with any type of program, right? So specifically diversity and inclusion, when you use that term, share best practices, it's usually somebody sharing what they did that worked, and then people taking that and scaling it and making it work in their organization, right?
Yeah.
And when you do that, that leaves little room for innovation. So if everybody's doing something similar, who's really going to be the one to break out and do something different that'll really shake the needle up, right? So I think I've seen a lot of programs that have just been really effective, like mentoring and sponsorship programs, programs to fill the pipeline or to ensure that employees have a place inside of the organization, like you have your council internally at Quorum, there are employee resource groups or affinity groups or whatever it may be. But what's really, so COVID definitely was a way that, a challenge that kind of tripped people up, right? But companies really were able to step up, and adjust those D&I initiatives to make it fit. So for instance, one of our member companies has had their Women's Leadership Network for years. It's their largest affinity group within their organization. And through that group, they've been working on mentoring as a way to advance women into leadership positions within their company. And so when COVID hit and people had to work remotely, it was much harder to do these mentoring opportunities. Leadership was really busy and trying to see, deal with the challenges that were coming up in the business side of COVID challenges. People weren't really wanting to engage. It was much harder there were a lot of other meetings that were coming up. And so what they did was they set up a micro mentoring program so that the women were still able to get some time with senior leadership. And it wasn't like you have a devoted mentor, but you were able to check in with a number of different leadership executives. And then do a quick 30-minute kind of, this is the issue I'm having, or tell me what made you successful. And so I think, like I said, having the best practices is helpful because then you kind of scale the D&I work, but really having the challenges makes people think outside of the box and think of ways to innovate.
Yeah, I absolutely love that point, right? Like, you have to measure kind of where you are, right? And then you have to come up with a very tailored approach so that you meet the needs of your organization. And I think that's so smart because, when I think about Quorum in general, right? Like, even within Quorum, like, each department has its own kind of goals, right? And its own challenges. And we try to come up with very tailored and specific approaches, not only as a collective, but even on that micro level for how do we make progress at each and every step. To me, that does, go again. It goes back to the point of measuring, where you are. And I think one of the questions that comes to mind immediately is how do you successfully measure where you are as an organization, in the inclusion and diversity space, before starting and maybe taking some of those best practices and putting them into work? Can you speak to a little bit about how might an organization be able to do that if they haven't been able to do that so far?
So there are a number of different ways that we've seen. Definitely collecting demographic information helps the organization really understand the diversity that they have. Although it's, it's optional whether an employee answers it or not, it still does help kind of create that baseline diversity data for you to help you measure it. But if you really look at inclusion, I think not the only way, but one of the best ways to really measure it and understand where you are is to lean into that discomfort and have these conversations. A lot of companies were really against talking about diversity and inclusion, or it was, okay, we've set up this program and the people that are working on that program are the ones that are doing the diversity and inclusion work and they're going to talk about it. But it wasn't an organization-wide conversation. And I think having that conversation, understanding what your employees are facing, what your leadership is facing, what your senior managers and middle managers are facing, and kind of having the empathy and learning, that's the place to measure where you currently are. I think by understanding where your organization is and talking to employees about their experience, then you're better able to say, well, 50% of our employees talked about this one issue over and over and over again. Maybe this is an issue we need to address. Let's dig a little deeper. Let's do a survey. Let's collect some data. Let's build a program or whatever it may be. But I think it really starts with talking to and better understanding the employees and the experiences that they're having.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. You know, what that makes me think of is, on one hand, like, you do have to kind of focus on like the more strategical, like metric oriented approaches, right, in the programming and initiatives front. But like, you know, that thing about understanding where everyone is at, right? Like, that's something to me that speaks to a much more individual, one-to-one, peer-to-peer kind of conversation, something that isn't so targeted with like an objective at the end, right? Like, you really genuinely want to know where people are at, how they feel, how they think. I'd love to kind of focus, you know, a few questions on that. Like, as the individual, right? Like, what can people do? Not like as like a work, well, maybe as a workplace, like colleague, a friend, or whatever, or even just in their daily lives, right? When it comes to making, you know, their workplace, their colleagues, their friends safer, you know, more included, the atmosphere that they work in, more constructive for their peers, what can they do? What should we be thinking about on an individual level as we move forward?
Definitely. And I'll back up a little bit just to add. I think definitely having open conversations is key, like I mentioned. I still would put parameters on any conversations that we have in the workplace related to D&I, right? We're still all there to do a job, and it's really important to still, even though you go into the conversation, having it be open and an expansive conversation, really have some goals and things that you want to get out of this. Like, by the end of this conversation, leadership really wants to understand what is bothering employees about not being able to advance within their careers. How can we make it better for employees to advance? So there should always be some parameters around it that are tied still to the business, right? Because as we've seen in the last couple of months, when we have these open conversations and open town halls, a lot of the stuff that's happening outside will come inside, and sometimes that could blind people to the goal, which is we're all here for a similar mission at this organization and to move it forward. And so how can we all feel welcome and engaged and encouraged to move that mission forward? And so with that, like the individuals, I think definitely individuals, there's a lot we can do. We've heard about allyship tons. We put together a member Zoom call earlier this year. Airbnb created an allyship guide. Their Black ERG came together and created an allyship guide for their colleagues with really how to engage to help those Black employees that were feeling a certain way after the murder of George Floyd. And so we shared that guide with our member companies as a way to start an allyship program or talk about it or wherever. So I think definitely thinking about IND or DNI as an individual, having allyship. And so when I say allyship, it doesn't just mean the unmarginalized or the represented groups being allies for those underrepresented groups in an organization. It's definitely being an ally in every space and place that you can, right? Because in any situation, privilege and power and, you know, it's relative, right? In the space, I could be the only English speaking person. And so I would have that privilege and power, and I can be an ally to those non-English speaking individuals in the group that I'm in. So definitely for everyone to think about IND as having a role in allyship, but just having a role, period. Like DNI is not just for the diverse communities, it's for everyone. And everyone needs to have a role in how that moves forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely hear what you're saying in terms of everyone. I think one of the things that I read about that are sometimes challenging, right, is that managers and then senior leadership, you know, sometimes I feel like I've read about maybe perhaps disconnects, right, between like what people on the, like, you know, what employees are feeling and what, you know, their managers and their senior leadership are doing. And like, there's conflict there. And I think, you know, sometimes that can birth a lot of frustration and problems internally in an organization. So, you know, if you are on that senior leadership front. If you are a manager, if you're a little higher up in the organization, what can they be doing to be effective allies and supporters of this kind of work?
Definitely. So I think when you and I had a conversation to prepare for this, we talked about D&I as a skill set, right? So it's a set of skills that people develop, and like any skill set, you need to practice it and use it and develop the muscle. And so same with leadership, right? Leaders are trained, they're not just born. You're not born being a great leader. So people sometimes become managers because there's a void, and so they fill that void and get a promotion and become a manager that way. Or they've done really great work but have never supervised or managed people. And so really good organizations train their managers. They give them leadership development skills. They invest in the leadership of their company. And so I think as a leader, you also need to think about investing in those I&D and D&I skills. So what does that mean? Getting inclusive leadership training, how to be an inclusive and empathetic leader, getting unconscious bias training or bias training overall, right? We all have biases. How can we learn to recognize the biases that we have and then overcome them, especially leaders? So I think for leadership really to embrace this is to start within themselves and invest in the training of having better leaders and more empathetic and D&I skilled leaders.
Excellent. No, I love that point. I love what you said about thinking of it as a skill set, right? Like it is a necessary component that people need to learn, not only just to be successful for the right thing, but also to be successful in an organizational kind of professional way too. And I think we all need to remember that as we go forward, right? We have to continuously learn and relearn what I&D means. I think like that's something that, resonates with me a lot. For everybody's awareness, our slogan at Quorum when it comes to inclusion and diversity is trust and progress, right? We trust that the work is never done so that we can constantly progress in this space. And, in my journey, I've never stopped learning or reading up on kind of different types of people. And I've learned so many different things along the way that I really would have never thought about in the larger scheme of things. And that's only being lucky enough to be in this space and being around people who come from different backgrounds and places and professions and all that stuff. And so definitely encourage everybody on this call to continue, engaging with your peers, meeting as many different types of people as possible and keeping like that open and empathetic mind, just because, there's, in my opinion, there's no way an organization can be ever truly inclusive, right? Like there are always people out there who aren't understood, and that's kind of what I&D, in my opinion, is all about. And I think, hey, but you nailed it on the head with the skill set part. So I think one thing, when you get into I&D, right, I think you get lost in the acronyms a little bit, right? Like we've said a couple things like ERGs and things like that. And I realize that there are probably at least a few folks on this call who may not understand what that is, right? So really quickly, can you explain to me like, what is an affinity group and an employee resource group or an ERG, right? Like what are the values these groups can bring to an organization, and like, why do they exist?
Sure. So employee resource groups or affinity groups are employee identity or experience-based groups that help build community within an organization. A lot of times they're created at the grassroots level. Employees band together around a certain experience or identity. They form these groups to help support one another or engage with one another. They started out actually in 1964 at Xerox, when Black workers organized to discuss race-based tensions in the workplace. So they've been around for a really, really long time. And then today, they, of course, employees help support each other, but they also help do a lot more, right? So we had a session at CES in 2020 on the D&I track that really looked at how ERGs can affect the bottom line. So they help companies actually launch new products, right? They're the first test group for a product or a service. They help companies, especially we've seen it around COVID, when COVID launched, or even with all of the social justice conversations that were happening. A lot of companies went to their ERGs to get feedback on the statements that they were putting out, or to develop resources. So when COVID hit, there was a lot of anti-Asian American sentiment around coronavirus, and a lot of misinformation was coming out. A lot of ERGs banded together to support the Asian American ERG groups, but also to put out resources about how to combat the hate and to create a dialogue and understanding, right? So I think that's really a great way that ERGs are doing that work. Again, to bring up CES, we hosted an ERG experience at CES 2020 this year, which you came, we just talked about earlier how you came as a part of that, but we invited our member companies to bring members of their employee resource groups or affinity groups, or if they had one person that was in charge of like creating that inclusive workplace culture to come to CES. And then we created a schedule for them to be able to engage with one another, learn from one another, and then experience CES. So it was your first CES, but in that group, it was a bunch of other people's first CES as well. And there were so many connections that were made and programs that were taken back to organizations to help straighten those ERG experiences, right? So Google had shared that they give 25% of the employee time to engage in ERGs. And so a bunch of different companies had the opportunity to talk with Google about how do they do that? How do they position that? How can we do that at our organization? And then I know a lot of the smaller companies talked to you, Neil, because you are the only CTA small businesses and startups within our D&I working group that have a staff council. And so how did you develop it? What kind of programs do you run and lead? And so I know you were really popular in sharing your best practices for the work that you did on that.
Oh, thanks. That's nice to say. I'm happy to hear that people got value out of that. No, listen, but that's great. Thank you so much. We're running kind of close to kind of the end here. And I just wanted to end on a few thoughts here. First, I just want to thank you for your time. You've shared so much good information with everyone here. I think for everybody who's on the phone, right? At times, inclusion and diversity and doing it right, and then, thinking about all of it, it can be a little bit overwhelming, even for me at times, right? Like I'm always, cognizant of, am I doing the right thing? Am I saying the right thing? Am I making, any mistakes and all that stuff? And what I would just love for everybody to remember is that it is okay to make mistakes, right? Like this is not a industry in which you can be perfect all the time. You have to kind of fall on your face a few times to make progress in the right way. I'll share a story with y'all just to let you know that like even us who are maybe in this field can really, have our moments. It was early in 2019 at Quorum. We hosted a really wonderful panel discussion about, how to build the most inclusive and diverse companies in the tech space. And we partnered with some organizations in DC. And there was a wonderful partner of ours from this company called Translator, the CEO of Translator. Her name is Natalie Egan. She's a trans woman. And so before our panel discussion started, I had, put my remarks together. I made all the pronouns as inclusive as I possibly could. But, for me, there are times where I get, into the conversations like these. I did it earlier today where I just start moving a million miles an hour. I make a slip. I try to correct myself. But during this panel in which it was ultra important for me to be cognizant of that, I remember I said guys, right? Natalie made it very clear at the beginning that this is going to be a no guy space, meaning that we're not going to use pronouns that are connected to gender or any way, shape, or form. That's what we're going to try to avoid. And I did it like 4 or 5 times. And every time I did it, Natalie would make this sound that was like what you would hear at like the end of a quarter in a basketball game. She would, and this is in front of like dozens of people, and like that, she'd go, and I just was like, oh my God. And then, in the moment I quickly recovered and I was like, it's all right, you're not going to do it again. I did it like 4 or 5 times throughout that entire panel. And she blew me up every single time. And, naturally at the end of it, I was so flustered, right? I went up to Natalie. I apologized. To her credit, she was so kind, and she wasn't rude about it. She told me like, it's all right. Like it happens. I'm just happy to hear that you're thinking about it. And, feeling like a fool, I started just kind of walking around this event, and everybody, I heard, they also made the same mistakes. Everybody was making gender specific like pronouns and stuff. But what was really cool to see is that everybody, in the same way that I did, they caught themselves, just like I did earlier in this conversation. I said, guys, I was like, I'm sorry, I meant you all, right? But like, it just like for me in that moment, it showed me that even when you make mistakes, you can learn from your mistakes, and learning from your mistakes and showing, that you are trying to understand, include, and move forward. Those are the moments that really matter. And that's something that's really served me well. And I hope you all can think about that and, take that and apply that to your work going forward. So, we can end on that note. Again, Heba, you rock. Thank you so much for doing this for us. You're the best. If any of y'all are interested in partnering with CES or even Quorum, please let us know. Quorum, kind of like CES, we partner with a lot of different types of organizations, large and small. We have developed a wonderful Path for Progress initiative. Please look it up. It is an initiative that is specific to companies who are in the DMV area. We're trying to build a regional partnership with companies of all sizes, tech, public affairs, you name it. We want to build a coalition. We want to do kind of the same thing that CES is doing on a larger scale. We want to learn from y'all. We want to share best practices. We want to build this community into something that's really special. And again, not for the accolades or anything like that, but so that we can, continue to be better for the people who work for us and around us and all that good stuff. So, all right, y'all. Well, enjoy the rest of the summit. Thanks for everybody who attended today, and we'll catch you later. Heba, thanks again. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.